36th episode of In Conversation with Convergence. As many of you know as followers, this is a monthly podcast where we feature our clients and we feature sometimes some very special guests. We discuss some of the top issues facing the industry, and today we'll be discussing the geopolitical and economic outlook for 2024. I have a terrific guest today. I'm joined by the Honorable Manisha Singh, and Manisha is a founder and principal of the Sunstone Strategy Group, but recently served at the U.S. State Department as the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. She was unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate as the first woman in history to lead the Bureau. And her department was really the liaison to the business community. She was the lead official on things like digital policy, cyber, intellectual property, sanctions, foreign investment, international trade, and finance. I'm thrilled to have you here, and Manisha, and I want to welcome you today.
George, thank you so much. It is my pleasure to appear on this 36th episode of your podcast. I know that you have a great following. It really is my privilege. Thank you so much for having me here and giving me the opportunity to talk to people about what's going on in the world this year. I hope everyone finds it interesting.
I think they will. So before we get started, I'm sure you can do a little better job on your pedigree and background than I did, but I think it's so impressive. I'd love for you to just kind of recap for people kind of the journey you've been on prior to founding Sunstone.
Thank you so much, George. I will give you sort of my life in a couple of minutes so that people can better understand my background and sort of my path to the State Department and to ultimately founding Sunstone as my own firm. So I'll go way back. My parents are immigrants from India. I am so lucky to be a citizen of the United States of America, having come here when I was just a child. And for me, Florida was home. So I grew up in Central Florida. Still haven't gotten entirely used to the cold weather up here, although in DC it's the climate is moderate. I am a lawyer by training. I attended the University of Florida College of Law and then made my way to Washington, D.C. I went to law school with the intent of trying to have an impact, trying to make a difference in the world. And of course, like everyone else in the United States who wants to do that, Washington seemed to be the exact right place for me to land. So I came to Washington, D.C., and I started off working at large law firms. The law firms were a great experience and great exposure for me because as a young 20-something, you get this real high level of responsibility. You know, by my late 20s, I was managing $100 million transactions for global clients around the world. It gave me a sense of the economic impact of business. I learned early on why economic policy was so important and why it's so critical that each nation have a strong economy, a strong labor force, because that's ultimately what contributes to stability and growth for us all. So after my training, my years at law firms, I looked around and I thought, law firms are a great place to start. I was a corporate international lawyer. And then I decided, let me look into public service. So I started having conversations with my friends around town and ultimately interviewed and landed a spot on Capitol Hill at the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. What a wonderful opportunity to serve the public by working for members of Congress. And due to my corporate background and understanding economic and trade issues, that was the portfolio I was given at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So at the time, I negotiated things like international tax treaties and investment agreements. My background as a corporate lawyer really gave me a great perspective on why it was so important for policymakers to get the rules just right. I had a very good perspective on how these rules that are enacted in Washington that sometimes take a long time to get through, they really matter to people in the real world. I understood the impact of treaties and legislation, the impact that it has on day-to-day Americans. So that was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And from there, I was given the opportunity to serve in the Bush administration in the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs. My title at the time was Deputy Assistant Secretary. And again, a great platform to be able to work for the American people. After that, I did some work in the private sector, including some time at JP Morgan. So again, going back to the private sector, and this time being able to explain how policymakers think and make policy and how it would impact capital markets around the world. I've been lucky, George, to work with some really great people at great institutions. So I'll flash forward a little bit to my last position at the State Department, again, serving the American people under President Trump. The Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs, as you mentioned, is in charge of the economic arm of the State Department worldwide. I had about 225 people based in Washington with the support of thousands of economic officers posted all over the world. And George, our economic officers, both Foreign Service and Civil Service, provide a critical function. They serve as our liaisons to different governments around the world. They explain American economic policies and they build relationships that are critical for American companies and investors to be able to successfully navigate the global economy. So, George, it was a great, great privilege for me to work for the American people yet again in this role. I feel like I accomplished a lot. One of my major programs of focus that is still going on at the State Department, I'm happy to say, was my program on women's economic empowerment. It was the Power Initiative, providing opportunities for women's economic rise. And this is a platform to help women start their own companies. As important as it is for women to be promoted in larger companies, I thought it was really critical that we provide a platform and fill the skills gap for women who want to become entrepreneurs themselves. So again, that was the Power Program, which I'm happy to say is still going on. Once I left the administration, I thought to myself, how can I contribute to the global economy from the private sector? How can I continue to be a good corporate citizen and make sure that everything works well for everyone? And that's why I founded Sunstone. And what I do at Sunstone is continue my public sector themes in the private sector. I advise companies on how to navigate sanctions, on how to successfully invest, whether in the United States or United States investors going overseas. I try to provide geopolitical insights because I think that the business community has learned that geopolitics is no longer just an area of interest, something to casually think about. Geopolitics and elections impact regulations. They impact how markets function. It really is a critical part of the business agenda to learn and understand geopolitical situations around the world. And that's the service that I provide through Sunstone Strategy Group, hoping to make sure that the economy continues growing positively, making sure companies have an opportunity to succeed, hire more workers, create economic growth, and create stability. And
Well,
George,
how old is Sunstone, Manisha, now?
I started Sunstone when I left the administration, so it's close to 3 years old now.
Good for you. And listen, two things that I think are interesting is we never crossed paths at JP Morgan, but I was there for about 10 years. And the more I meet people, I realize how big the JP Morgan alumni group is worldwide. And then two, I think the work you did on women is very near and dear to Convergence. One of the many things we monitor in the asset management industry is is the senior levels and our women in those C-suite ranks. And I think we continue to find great momentum and great improvement, but still not at the levels, right, in asset management that it needs to be or should be. Here's where I want to start. We have a number of things I think we were going to talk about today. I want to start with just kind of I'll call it economic growth trends, economic projections. And I thought maybe we could kind of start a little bit around, let's go back to 2020. Let's go back 3 or 4 years ago with the pandemic and what that pandemic in your eyes did to our economy or the GDP, et cetera. And then we can talk about how that economy rebounds a little bit.
Well, George, that's a very important time to start taking a look at what happened with the economy. As you know, 2020 started off to be a positive year. We had good growth in 2019. Starting about second quarter, though, in March was when the pandemic hit. The first quarter, at the end of first quarter in March was when the pandemic hit. By second quarter, if you look at numbers from the Department of Commerce, our GDP dropped by close to 30% because the entire world shut down. We literally could not operate, could not go to work, stores, restaurants, everything. Economic activity stopped entirely. However, in the next quarter of 2020, the economy did rebound because we did open up again. We started learning how to function in the COVID economy. Personal protective equipment. So restaurants started opening again. Grocery stores started functioning. There was a little bit of travel going on. So there was a significant rebound, which reflects the sharp decrease from the quarter before. And in 2020, we sort of inched along with minimal levels of economic growth. 2021 was a little bit better, but not much better than 2020. We had a new administration coming in, new policies. So the economy was sort of readjusting. The global world was readjusting to opening up. Vaccinations had happened. I remember in 2020, I was at the State Department and my job shifted entirely from managing economic priorities to returning American citizens home. That was quite the exercise. And moving forward to, looking at 2024, 2023 was a decent year economically. 2024, global projections still are not as high as one would have thought. The global economy is projected to grow by about 2.9%. So it's less than that 3% growth that we'd like to see. And the divide between advanced economies and emerging economies is also stark. The growth projection for advanced economies is 1.4%, whereas for emerging economies, it's over 4%. So you can see that divide, and then the global matrix shows up at 2.9% projected for 2024.
What do you, Manisha, on that, because now, while COVID seems a long time ago, it's still ever present, right? What are the things that you think are kind of some of the major kind of hangovers from the pandemic still in the economy, the things that are impacting kind of growth right now? You hear, like, we used to think supply chain, right? Things like that. But what would you say if you had to name the top 2 or 3 that are still maybe where we haven't fully rebounded?
Well, George, I think you just uttered the key words, supply chains. People before the pandemic, most people didn't think about where goods were produced or how they got to us. But all of a sudden, when the global economy stops, that means factories stop, transportation stop. We realize that we are not able to get our goods, the sufficient consumer goods that we need, and also the parts. If you think about anything from an iPhone to an automobile, the component parts of these devices come from somewhere. They are made in different locations. So if those locations can't produce the goods and can't get them shipped, we're not able to provide our economy with what it needs. Or for that matter, if there is one part that's being able to made, you're able to get the tires from somewhere, but you're not able to get the rest of the parts for the vehicle, it still results in an incomplete process. And so we saw that, supply chains were critical and critically important. And I don't know that we have recovered other than lessons learned. I think that's part of the lag in the economy right now. And then there are also different factors going on, like regulations and permitting. I think there was a point where we realized that in order to be energy independent in the United States, we have to increase our reliance on our own energy sources, speed up permitting, cut regulation. And I think some of those things are still impacting our ability to be, for instance, energy independent.
I think you make a really good point about lessons learned, right? I think that's really the point, right? You think about examples like microchips in Taiwan and antibiotics, right? 90% of antibiotics are produced in Asia. So I do think it was, in many cases, for lots of these highly dependent goods, right? That it was a wake up call, right? For the U.S. a little bit on some fronts, right? So, all right. So let's move to, we'd have to talk about the election year, 2024. And I don't just mean the U.S., but I think it's a massive election year globally. And I'd love for you to put that in perspective for our audience.
Absolutely, George. You're right. This is a massive election year. In fact, over 50% of the world's population is going to the polls. There are some major elections happening, with our own election coming up in November. But beyond that, for instance, India, the country of India, is going to go to the polls to see if Mr. Modi and his party can survive the elections there. So that's a big election coming up. And in India, you'll see some of the similar themes that people are concerned about here in the US and globally. There's this idea in India that, India has had a very successful technology economy, technology entrepreneurs. Yet there are groups of agrarian farmers that feel like they've been left behind, that they are not part of that technology economy. So we will see how their votes shape up. Do they want to change? Do they want to see a government that is not just focused on things like call centers and the big tech world, but also focused on what's happening with them, with the subsistence farmers in India? We'll also see an election before the end of 2024 in the UK. And of course, everybody remembers a lot of the drama that happened post-Brexit. We had Prime Minister Liz Truss, who was, I think, the shortest prime minister in the history of the UK. And so I think the UK is still settling from the effects of Britain, from the effects of trying to manage their economic growth. It's difficult to cut taxes yet maintain the spending that the UK citizens are used to. So Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is going to have to figure out a plan before the end of the year, and we'll see what happens to him. We'll also see elections in the EU. Interestingly, the trend towards EU in the EU elections right now is very populist. We all remember from the last several years the Gilets jaunes, the French farmer protests. Well, now there are farmers in Germany that are protesting as well for similar sets of reasons. As there are regulations out there to protect environment, to protect different issues, the farmers are saying, look at what this is doing to our livelihood. So the prediction right now is that the new EU Parliament is going to reflect the populist mood within the European Union.
Yeah, I mean, how about, let's talk about some of the state-controlled elections too, right? Your view on that, because that's some of them could be, when you think about the tensions with in the EU with NATO, et cetera, et cetera. Love to hear your views on the state-controlled elections that you see in 2024.
Well, George, that's a great question. And the most recent one was, of course, in Russia. We saw that, Vladimir Putin proudly stated that he had 88% of the vote, and everybody sort of said, yes, we think we know why that is the case. And I think that there were protests certainly over what had happened. And I think that's going to be the interesting thing for Vladimir Putin after this election, is people are finally starting to question what's going on. The war in Ukraine is in its third year, and the global community is very unhappy with everything going on, the atrocities in Ukraine. In addition, Russian citizens are starting to question the expenditures in Ukraine as well. They have their own domestic economic problems. And we saw in this election the protest votes being issued. And sadly, we see Russian dissidents like Alexei Navalny being taken down by the Putin government. So I think this year, Vladimir Putin and his entourage are going to see a lot more domestic dissatisfaction, and dissidents raise their voices in protest.
What do you think about countries like Iran, Venezuela, some of those others?
Well, Venezuela is an interesting situation because a few years ago, when I was in office, in fact, there was a contender to the current regime in Venezuela, and his name was Juan Guaido, you might remember. And if there had been a democratically election that were held valid in Venezuela, Juan Guaido would have been the new ruler of Venezuela. The United States supported him. Several European countries supported him as well. However, that did not come to pass. Juan Guaido was, there were threats on his life, and the current Venezuelan regime continues. The Biden administration has tried to make inroads with Venezuela. They tried to lift some of the extreme sanctions, particularly on Venezuela's oil economy, in exchange for democratic elections. However, that hasn't happened yet either. So it's disappointing to see that we haven't been able to make any progress in Venezuela, but I think we need to keep trying to make sure those sanctions pressure the current regime into recognizing a democratically elected successor.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to completely change the subject now. And I want to talk about AI, artificial intelligence. And, what I'm hoping you can comment on a little bit is how it might tie into the elections we just talked about. Actually, I saw an interesting piece on it where 60 Minutes touched on this a little bit recently. AI, how it's drawing investment and capital, and then you often read about is there going to be an AI bubble? I think the definition of AI can be very different, right? It's just simple things from iPhones using AI now to GPS, right? Is AI, right? But curious about your views of AI relative to the elections we just talked about, and the overall investment and capital being kind of thrown at AI.
Well, George, that you raise a really important issue this year, especially with this super election cycle. I think artificial intelligence has huge potential to impact the elections. And I know election authorities in all different countries are starting to take a look at this. You'll recall there was a phone message sent out in President Biden's voice, which was not actually President Biden. And that was an audio message. And if we think about how complicated it could be if these generative AI programs are able to create likenesses of actual politicians or actual figures, and the type of misinformation that could be spread. The danger of AI is there's this potential to not only spread misinformation, but spread it in a very convincing way to large amounts of people. And so the positive thing is I think that nations and election authorities are aware of this and are trying to do everything that they can to combat it. I know here in the US, we have various government agencies that are really taking a close look at this. The flip side is that AI can have a very positive benefit. You mentioned GPS. We know that artificial intelligence is helping the healthcare industry. For instance, one of the things that I learned about is that artificial intelligence is able to read things like x-rays and mammograms and detect even faster and more accurately than the human eye, human illness that comes up. So if you think about how valuable that could be in the case of a mammogram, if breast cancer is not detectable to the human eye, but artificial intelligence can detect it, this is an extremely valuable life-saving procedure that we will have available for us. So artificial intelligence, I think, will be the future, but we have to manage it carefully. The two companies that have come out with the chips that are necessary for the multitasking for artificial intelligence are NVIDIA and Micron. And of course, we've seen that NVIDIA, it really is the AI darling right now. I think that they had the foresight to create the chip that was going to be able to power AI as needed. But we've also seen problems with AI. The technology is there, but when it comes to, for instance, Google's Gemini, there were situations where if Google Gemini was asked to create a portrait of a couple from a certain era, the couple that it portrayed was not accurate for that era. So there are accuracy issues when it comes to generative AI, and this goes into the misinformation. If you can detect that the generative AI is inaccurate, that's one thing. But what if you can't? What if you're relying on information that is not accurate or not correct? So we have to be careful how we deploy this artificial intelligence. And I believe all the companies, Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, are thinking through this to make sure that when artificial intelligence reaches into our daily lives, that we will have a sense of accuracy and a comfort level using it.
Well, what's interesting, Manisha, about what you say is it's a very advanced problem, but it's very similar to what continues to go on, say, on social media, right? With TikTok and X and Facebook, and how the policing that has to go on around mis and disinformation, yet the constant battle of, well, that's my First Amendment right, I can say what I want, right? But when I think about AI, there's certainly, and you bring up the healthcare example, there's certainly much more good in the world to be achieved with AI, and I think we've got to just figure out how to control kind of the bad actors, like anything, right? All right, the final topic I wanted to do today with you, Manisha, is I want to do just a little more deeper dive around that election year. And we don't take sides here, Republicans or Democrats, but I really would like you to talk first a little bit about the EU and the parliamentary elections, which you touched on a little bit. And let's just kind of call this more of a regional analysis, right? And then kind of the U.S. legislative and presidential elections. So, and I think we can finish up with that. I found our listeners are good for about 35, 40 minutes, right? So as we'll finish up, I think, with this pretty interesting topic.
Well, George, that it is a very interesting topic, and I'll tie, starting with the EU, I'll tie back into the theme on artificial intelligence that we talked about. You're absolutely right that AI has the potential for good, and we just need to manage it. The European Union, just in the last 2 weeks, passed an AI law that set some boundaries and parameters on misinformation. One of the interesting things about the EU AI Act is that the European Union does not want it to be used for biometric identification, because we've seen that some of the facial recognition technologies have been used to single out and identify dissident groups, minority groups in various countries. And so the EU AI Act affirmatively states that it won't be used for that reason. Basically, they want it used for, the EU is saying, is safe and trustworthy, for economically beneficial, for climate matters, for sustainability. So there's a long list in this EU AI Act of what AI needs to be used for. And that's a nice segue into the EU elections. I think that the EU is going to have to start looking more closely at how voters are feeling. For instance, one of the member state elections in last November was in the Netherlands. And this is where Geert Wilders was elected. I spoke to some friends in the Netherlands, and everybody said, well, Geert Wilders is sort of a far right, not traditionally the way that the Dutch think. The populist parties are worried about things that people globally are worried about the economy, worried about what immigration is doing to their societies. So it was a bit of a surprise that Wilders was elected. And if you look at other member states, you have these similar themes of where the populations are asking or electing governments that they think are going to be more responsive to their needs, to the local economy, to the makeup of the local population. And that's likely what we're going to see in the EU parliamentary elections as well. I think that the EU is at a time of reckoning. Beyond Brexit, there are these smaller movements. And before, these politicians were not thought of as mainstream, the ones who were the Eurosceptics. But George, that is changing. This year, I think the European Union will see more of these Eurosceptics in line. Brussels is going to have a big challenge on its hands to be able to manage all of the different views from the member states that ultimately reflect what the people are thinking. So the EU is in for a year of huge challenges, I think.
Yeah. How about then let's flip it with the U.S. legislative and the presidential election.
Well, George, 2024 is going to be a big year. As we know, this is the first time where we've had, I believe the first time, certainly in a long time, that we've had two incumbent presidents basically running. We know President Biden's record from the last almost 4 years now, and we have 4 years on which to judge President Trump as well. And as we talked about, 2020 was an interesting election year because it happened during COVID. There were a lot of different things that were motivating people to vote. And now that President Biden has been in office, I think voters will have a chance to judge and see his record, and President Trump's record is noted as well. I think for the Biden administration this year they're going to have to make some tough choices because the economy still has not rebounded to the levels people thought it would. And as I laid out the economic growth projection rates, those are still on the lower side. Consumer prices are still relatively high. So people are feeling like even if the economic indicators are positive and job growth numbers are positive, that's not necessarily translating to the average person. So I think the Biden administration is going to have to make some tough choices on some of the regulations, things like the environmental programs or climate programs that they have in place, meaning the electric vehicle mandates. What is that going to mean for workers in a state like Michigan, where auto manufacturing is sort of, that's where it was invented. That's what Detroit, Michigan is known for, to be the car manufacturer of the world. So I think the Biden administration is in for some tough choices, and we'll see how voters respond to that. President Trump, on the other hand, can go back to his record. He's going to have to demonstrate why the positive aspects of his administration are the ones that voters should focus on. In 2018 and 2019, there was a strong economy. And, as I mentioned, 2020 year was just a year that turned the world upside down. So President Trump, if he can make the case about the positive economy, a lot of his foreign policy successes, then that might resonate with voters. But overall, each side is going to have to present the most positive version of themselves and let the voter decide. Ultimately, I think it's going to come down to economy and employment numbers, housing numbers. The Fed has signaled that it plans 3 rate cuts this year. The first one perhaps coming in June. That's going to impact economic issues as well. Those rate cuts are going to make a difference in the economy just before the election. So I would say that we also need to watch carefully what the Fed does.
Yeah, listen, I think it's well said. I think voters this time around have some very good track record to look at with both, right? And people are going to make a decision based on what's most important to them, right? And so listen, I want to thank you. We covered quite an array of topics. You're a true professional, and I want to really thank you for joining me. You were a terrific guest, and I wish you and Sunstone the best in terms of your vision and growth. And again, just want to thank you for making time for us here at Convergence, Manisha.
It was my pleasure, George. Thank you for having me on and having the opportunity to speak to your viewers.